Karoline Levitt sat calmly in the tense studio, her quiet strength a stark contrast to the glaring lights and buzzing cameras. Across from her, a seasoned reporter smirked with barely veiled contempt, ready to dismantle her unshakable faith. But what happened next would leave the entire room speechless and force one man to confront his own beliefs. Before we dive into the full story, drop a comment letting us know where you're watching from. If you love gripping tales like this, don't forget to subscribe because tomorrow we've got another incredible story waiting for you. The studio crackled with tension, a battlefield primed for confrontation. Cameras stood ready, their red lights blinking like eyes waiting to judge. At the center sat Karoline Levitt, her posture steady, hands calm in her lap. She was no stranger to scrutiny, a woman whose name carried weight because of her unshakable faith, a quiet force that defined her without fanfare. Her dark hair framed a face that held no trace of fear, her eyes locked forward, unflinching. Across from her, James Carver leaned in, his sharp features taut with purpose. A veteran journalist, he'd made a career out of tearing down facades, and today, Karoline was his target. His salt-and-pepper hair and steely gaze hinted at experience, but the glint in his eyes betrayed something darker, a personal edge that made this more than just another interview. The air between them was thick, heavy with unspoken stakes. James had come prepared, armed with hours of research and a stack of notes he clutched like a weapon. To him, Karoline was a fraud in waiting, her reputation as a woman of faith nothing more than a polished lie. He'd heard the claims, that her beliefs were her bedrock, guiding her every step, but he didn't buy it, not for a second. He was here to expose her, to rip away the mask he was sure she wore. Karoline, though, didn't blink. She'd faced questions like this before, probes meant to trip her up, to find a crack in her resolve. But today felt different. The tension wasn't just in the room, it was in James's voice, his posture, the way he gripped the table as if bracing for a fight. The crew hushed as the cameras rolled, every lens zeroed in on the clash about to unfold. James thrived in this pressure, his mind racing with strategies to break her. He'd seen her kind, people who paraded their principles until the heat got too intense, then folded. Karoline didn't fit that mold. She sat there, composed, her calm almost defiant, like she knew something he didn't. That only fueled his determination. He'd spent the night crafting questions to unravel her, to make her squirm under the weight of his doubt. She was a puzzle he intended to solve, a story he'd rewrite as a cautionary tale. But her steady gaze unnerved him, a silent challenge he couldn't ignore. James flashed a tight smile, the kind that promised trouble, and leaned closer. His voice sliced through the silence, smooth but edged with venom. "Karoline," he started, each word deliberate. "You've built your whole identity on this so-called faith of yours. It's the foundation of everything you are. At least, that's what you tell people. But I've noticed something today." He paused, his smirk sharpening as he let the moment stretch, the tension coiling tight. No cross, no symbols, nothing. "So tell me, is this faith real or just a prop you forgot to bring?" The question hit like a jab, calculated to provoke. The crew held their breath, waiting for her to falter, but Karoline didn't flinch. Her eyes stayed locked on his, unwavering, as if she'd been waiting for this exact moment. James wanted a crack in her armor. What he didn't know was that Karoline's strength didn't need armor. It was forged in something deeper, something he was about to test whether he was ready or not. Karoline sat still, her hands resting calmly in her lap, her gaze locked on James. His accusation hung between them, sharp and deliberate. But she didn't flinch. When she spoke, her voice was steady, slicing through his taunt with quiet force. "James," she said, "if you think faith is a cross I need to wear or a slogan I should shout, you've got it all wrong. It's not a costume. It's not for your approval. It's in what I do, how I live, how I treat people. That's my—" James's eyes narrowed, her calm stoking his irritation. He'd expected a stumble, a hint of panic, something to grab onto. Instead, she handed him nothing but that unshakable serenity, and it pissed him off. "Oh, that's rich," he snapped, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "What I do, how I live? Nice dodge, Karoline, but where's the substance? You're sitting here preaching faith with nothing to back it up, no symbols, no evidence. You expect people to just buy that?" Karoline's expression didn't shift, but her tone hardened slightly. "I don't expect anyone to buy anything, James. I'm not selling. My faith isn't here to impress you. It's not a billboard I flash for claps." It's in the choices I make, the ones you don't see because you're too busy looking for props. If that's not enough for you, that's your problem. Your choices, James barked, cutting her off. Don't give me that high and mighty crap. You talk like it's some noble secret, but it's just vague nonsense. What choices? You're dodging again. Give me something real or admit it's all hot air. He leaned forward, his knuckles white against the table, daring her to crack. Karoline met his glare head on. Real? You want real? It's in every day I don't bend to people like you, people who think faith is a performance I owe them. It's in how I help when no one's watching, not how loud I yell about it. You're fishing for a show, James. You won't get one. Her words landed like a slap, and James's jaw tightened. He wasn't used to this someone who wouldn't bite, wouldn't break. It threw him, and he hated it. No show, huh? He shot back, his voice rising. How convenient. Let's talk about something real then. That religious scandal a few years ago. People getting screwed over, begging for someone like you to step up. And what'd you do? Nothing. Zilch. You went silent. If your faith's so damn solid, why'd you hide? Too scared to back it up? Karoline's eyes flashed for a split second, the first hint of something raw, but she reined it in fast. Scared? She repeated, her voice low and cutting. You think I hid? I didn't owe you or anyone a speech. While you and the rest were chasing headlines, I was there helping the people who actually mattered. Quietly. No cameras, no applause. That's faith, James, not your circus. Helping? He scoffed, his tone venomous. That's your excuse? You skipped the fight because you were helping? In the shadows? Bullshit. You bailed when it got tough. Admit it. You're no saint. You're just good at dodging the heat. Karoline leaned in slightly, her calm now edged with steel. Dodge? I don't run from anything. I didn't speak because words wouldn't fix it. Actions did. I don't need to prove myself to you by jumping into your ring. You want a punching bag? Look somewhere else. I'm not your punching bag, and my faith isn't your toy. James froze, his comeback stalling in his throat. Her refusal to play his game hit harder than any shout. He'd wanted a brawl, she'd given him a mirror. The tension spiked, his frustration boiling as her quiet defiance left him grasping for control. James's face twisted into a sneer, his patience unraveling like a frayed rope. Karoline's calm was a splinter under his skin, and he was done playing nice. He slammed his hand on the table, the sharp crack jolting the studio. You're full of it, Karoline, he growled, his voice rising, thick with venom. All this talk about faith in your actions, where was it when it really counted? If your faith is so damn strong, why didn't you stand up and defend it when people needed you most? He leaned in, eyes blazing, his words a calculated strike. I'm talking about that mess a few years back. Churches burned, families torn apart, people crying out for someone to speak. And you? You sat on your hands, silent as a ghost. What's that say about your precious faith? Too weak to show up when it's inconvenient? The accusation was a grenade, lobbed with vicious intent. It wasn't true, not exactly. James had twisted a half-remembered rumor into a full-blown fiction, a scandal he'd conjured to trap her. The crew exchanged nervous glances, sensing the line he'd crossed. A producer in the back hissed into a headset, "He's losing it." Someone rein him in. The audience murmured, a low buzz of unease rippling through the seats. Karoline's jaw tightened, her hands clenching briefly in her lap. For the first time, a flicker of something raw, anger maybe, flashed in her eyes, sharp and fleeting, like lightning behind a storm cloud. But she didn't break. She drew a slow breath, her voice steady when it came, though it carried a new weight. "You're making up stories now, James," she said, her tone cool but edged. "I don't remember any churches burning or me sitting idle. But if you're asking why I don't always jump into the fray, it's simple. I don't fight for show. I act where it matters, not where it's loudest." James laughed, a harsh, grating sound that cut through her words. "Oh, spare me the martyr act," he spat. "You're dodging again, always with the vague holier-than-thou excuses. Where it matters. What a load. People were hurting, Karoline, and you didn't say a damn thing. You let them twist in the wind because you didn't have the guts to back your so-called faith with real spine." He jabbed a finger at her, his voice booming. "Admit it, you're a coward hiding behind pretty words." The crew flinched, the air in the studio thickening with dread. A technician muttered, "He's gonna tank this whole thing," while the audience's whispers grew louder, some nodding, others shaking their heads. Karoline's eyes narrowed, the flicker of anger hardening into something fiercer, though her face stayed composed. "A coward?" she shot back, her voice low but slicing like a blade. "You think courage is yelling into a microphone? I was there, James. Helping, not grandstanding. I didn't owe you a press conference to prove it. You want to paint me as weak because I didn't play your game? Go ahead. It doesn't change what I did." James pounced, his tone savage. "Helping? Where? Show me the receipts. You're spinning fairy tales now. I was there, quietly saving the day. Bullshit. If you were half the believer you claim, you'd have stood up, loud and proud, not slunk around in the shadows like some ashamed nobody." He was shouting now, veins bulging in his neck, his control slipping fast. "You're a fraud, Karoline. A fraud who bails when the heat's on." Karoline leaned forward, her calm cracking just enough to reveal steel beneath. "A fraud?" she said, her voice rising for the first time, sharp and unyielding. "I don't bail, James. I don't run. I stayed silent because I was busy. Busy with the people you ignored while you chased your headlines. You want me to scream about it so you can feel good tearing me down? That's not faith. That's your circus and I'm not your clown." Her words hit hard, each one a hammer strike, and James recoiled, his fury faltering for a split second. The producer barked into the headset, "Get ready to cut, he's unhinged." The audience was on edge, some leaning forward, others whispering furiously. James's face flushed red, his hands trembling as he gripped the table. "My circus?" he roared. "You're the one playing saint here. You think you're above us all, don't you? Too pure to get dirty in the real fight." He was losing it, his attack wild now, desperate to reclaim the upper hand. Karoline didn't budge, her gaze locked on him, the faint anger in her eyes burning steady. The clash was electric, and the room braced for what came next. James's last words still echoed, his voice raw and ragged, a desperate attempt to claw back dominance. The studio was a pressure cooker, the air thick with the heat of their clash. Karoline sat motionless for a beat, her eyes locked on him, the faint spark of anger now a steady flame. Then she rose, not abruptly but with a deliberate grace that silenced the room. Her hands rested lightly on the table, but her presence loomed large, a quiet force about to break. When she spoke, her voice was steady, resonant, carrying a weight that cut through James's bluster like a blade through smoke. "You want to know why I stayed silent, James?" she began, her tone measured but unyielding. "It wasn't fear, it wasn't weakness, it was a choice to act instead of talk. While you and your kind were screaming for sound bites, I was out there with the people who'd lost everything. Homes gone, lives shattered. I didn't need a stage to help them. I didn't need a microphone to prove my faith." Her words landed hard, each one a stone building a wall James couldn't climb. The crew froze, the audience held its breath, and even the cameras seemed to lean in, capturing every second of her resolve. She straightened, her gaze piercing through him. "I hauled supplies, sat with families, listened to their pain, not because it'd make headlines, but because it was right. That's what faith is to me, doing the work when no one's watching, not shouting about it to win some pointless fight. You think I should have stood on a soapbox, waving my arms for your approval? That's not strength, that's vanity." Her voice rose slightly, not in volume but in intensity, a tide of conviction swelling beneath her calm. "So tell me, James, what do you want me to yell for? To prove I'm tougher than you? Better than you? I don't need to, my actions did that already." James's face twisted, his confidence crumbling under the weight of her truth. He'd pushed her, baited her, expecting a crack he could exploit. But this was no crack. This was a flood, washing away his footing. He gripped the table, his knuckles white, his breath coming fast. "Actions?" he spat, his voice cracking with desperation. "That's your big defense? Some vague story about playing hero in the dark? You're delusional, Karoline. You didn't speak because you didn't have the guts to face the real heat." He was grasping now, his words wild, but she didn't flinch. She stepped closer, her eyes burning into his, and delivered the blow that tipped him over the edge. "Guts," she said, her voice low and fierce. "I faced the heat where it mattered out there, not in here with you. You want me to scream to prove something? I don't play for your crowd. I live what I believe, whether you see it or not. What about you, James? What do you live for? Ratings? Revenge?" The question hung like a guillotine, sharp and final. James's mouth opened, but nothing came out at first. Her challenge had stripped him bare, exposing the hollowness behind his attack. The crew watched, wide-eyed, as he unraveled. His hands shook, his face flushed red, and then it burst out. A raw, unfiltered explosion, "You sanctimonious bitch," he shouted, the insult ripping through the studio like a gunshot. "You think you're so damn pure? You're nothing, just a fake hiding behind your little savior act." The words were venom, spat out in a fit of rage, and the room gasped. A producer yelled, "Cut it, now!" But the cameras kept rolling, catching every ugly second. Karoline didn't recoil. She stood there, unflinching, her gaze steady as his outburst echoed. "Is that all you've got?" she said, her voice calm but cutting, a quiet thunder that drowned his noise. "Call me what you want, James. It doesn't change a thing. I know what I've done, what I am. Can you say the same?" Her words were a mirror held up to his chaos, and he couldn't look away. He staggered back, his chest heaving, his control shattered. The audience sat stunned, the crew scrambled, but Karoline remained a rock, unshaken, her truth laid bare, a force he couldn't break. James's outburst still reverberated, his crude insult hanging like a stain in the air. The studio erupted into chaos, not from Karoline's response, but from the frantic scramble behind the scenes. In the control booth, the producer, a wiry man named Tom with sweat beading on his forehead, barked into his headset, "Cut the feed, cut it now!" His voice cracked with panic, hands flailing as he waved at the tech crew. "We're live and he's losing it. This is a damn lawsuit waiting to happen." The screens flickered with the raw footage, James's red face and Karoline's steely calm locked in a standoff that had spiraled beyond anyone's script. But James wasn't done. He spun toward the booth, his voice a roar over the chaos. "No cuts! We're not stopping! I'm finishing this!" He jabbed a finger at Karoline, his eyes wild. "She doesn't get to walk away looking like the saint here. I'll end her." The crew hesitated, torn between Tom's orders and James's fury. A young sound tech fumbled with the controls, muttering, "He's gonna sink us all," while another hissed, "Let him dig his grave, boss'll fire him after this." The audience shifted uneasily, their murmurs growing into a restless hum. Tom slammed his fist on the console, shouting, "James, you're done! Sit down or we're pulling the plug." But James ignored him, pacing like a caged animal, his focus locked on Karoline. "You think you've won?" he snarled at her. "You think you can just stand there all high and mighty and I'll back off? I'm not done with you, not by a long shot." His desperation was palpable, a man clinging to control as it slipped through his fingers. Amid the uproar, a petite assistant named Mia slipped through the chaos, darting to Karoline's side. Her voice was a rushed whisper, barely audible over the shouting. "Miss Leavitt, you need to know, James isn't just after a story. It's personal. His family kicked him out years ago, said he was a disgrace for rejecting their religion. He's hated anyone who talks faith ever since. You're like a walking target for him." Mia's eyes flicked nervously toward James, then back to Karoline. "He's unhinged. I think he wants to destroy you to prove something to himself." The revelation hit Karoline like a quiet jolt. She glanced at James, his rage suddenly making sense. Not just a journalist's ego, but a wounded man's vendetta. His attacks weren't about her faith, they were about his own ghosts. Karoline stood still, her mind racing as the storm swirled around her. James's voice cut through again, venomous and taunting. "What's wrong, Karoline? Nothing left to say? No more saintly speeches to save you?" He was baiting her, daring her to strike back, to give him the fight he craved. The crew watched, breathless, as Tom yelled, "Last chance, James! Stop or we're off air!" The audience leaned in, sensing the breaking point. Karoline faced a choice. Stay and slug it out, tearing into James with the truth Mia had just handed her, his pain, his hypocrisy, or walk away, letting his chaos consume itself. Her hands tightened briefly, then relaxed. She could end him here, expose his motives live on air, turn his attack into his undoing. But something flickered in her, a question not of victory but of purpose. Was this worth it? She looked at James, a man unraveling before her, and weighed her next move. The studio was a tempest, James's taunts clashing with the producer's shouts, the air electric with the weight of the moment. Karoline stood at the center of it, her figure a quiet island amid the storm. James loomed before her, his face twisted in a snarl, daring her to hit back. "Come on, Karoline, say it. Prove me wrong or admit you're nothing." His voice trembled with fury, a man teetering on the edge of his own unraveling. The crew braced for her response, the audience held its breath, and the cameras zoomed in, hungry for the kill shot. She could have ended him, could could have turned Mia's revelation into a weapon, exposing his pain, his hypocrisy, and leaving him broken on live air. Her hands flexed at her sides, her mind sharp with the choice. But then something shifted in her eyes. Not anger, not triumph, but a clarity that cut deeper than any retort. Karoline stepped forward, closing the gap between them until she was just a breath away from James. The room fell silent, his ragged breathing the only sound. She looked up at him, her gaze steady, piercing through his rage. "James," she said, her voice low but resonant, each word a deliberate gift. "I don't need you to understand me, but I hope one day you understand yourself." The simplicity of it struck like a thunderclap, stripping away the noise. She didn't shout, didn't accuse. She offered him something he couldn't fight, a mirror. Then, without another word, she turned and walked away. Her steps were measured, her posture unbroken as she moved toward the exit. The studio doors swung shut behind her, and the silence that followed was deafening. James stood frozen, his mouth agape, the fire in his eyes snuffed out by confusion. His hands dropped to his sides, trembling, as if her words had pulled the plug on his fury. The audience sat stunned, some whispering, others staring in disbelief at the empty space she'd left. "What the hell just happened?" a crew member muttered, while Tom, the producer, slumped in the booth muttering, "She just flipped the whole damn script." James sank into his chair, his chest heaving, his mind reeling from the blow she'd dealt, not with fists, but with grace. The cameras kept rolling, capturing his collapse, but the fight was over. Karoline hadn't just walked away, she'd redefined the battlefield, leaving him to wrestle with himself. Days later, the story took an unexpected turn. A grainy video surfaced online, not from the interview, but from a security camera outside a small, weathered church on the city's edge. In it, James Carver stood alone, hands shoved deep in his pockets, his face shadowed by a hoodie. He lingered at the steps, staring at the doors, his posture heavy with something unspoken. Regret, maybe, or doubt. "So you didn't go in, didn't knock, just stood there for a long, quiet minute before turning away into the night." The clip spread like wildfire, viewers dissecting every frame, every twitch of his shoulders. Had Karoline's words cracked something in him? Was this a reckoning? A surrender? Or just a man lost in his own maze? No one knew, and James never spoke of it. The ending wasn't tidy. No apologies, no grand redemption. It was raw, open, a question mark hanging in the air. Karoline's exit had stunned the world not because she fought, but because she didn't. And James's silent pilgrimage to that church left everyone wondering, had she planted a seed or exposed a wound that might never heal? Karoline Leavitt's clash with James Carver teaches us that faith isn't a loud declaration or a shiny badge. It's a quiet strength, lived through actions, not applause. She didn't need to shout to prove her worth. Her choice to walk away, leaving James with a mirror to his own soul, showed that true belief doesn't bend to others' expectations. Life's battles aren't always won with words. Sometimes, they're won by standing firm in who you are, even when the world demands a fight. James's late-night vigil at the church hints at another truth. Our struggles with faith, or against it, often reflect wounds we won't face. Karoline didn't destroy him, she gave him a chance to question himself, a gift tougher than any blow. So, what's the takeaway? Live your truth authentically, not for the crowd, and let your deeds speak when words fail. Faith, like life, thrives in the silent moments of courage. What do you think? How do you stand firm in your beliefs? Drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. Loved this story? Hit subscribe. Tomorrow's tale is just as gripping.